It started with a single suspicion, and suddenly, no one in Trier was safe anymore. Imagine living in a prosperous city by the river, but then your hometown transforms into a place of horror. This is where our journey begins, in the grim city of Trier, a city full of towers, walls, and growing invisible fear. You walk through narrow streets and can almost feel the tension. Every glance could betray you, every word could be your death sentence. For in Trier, it is not truth that decides your fate. It is fear that dictates life and death, and one man who turned that fear into a system. Are you ready to look him straight in the face? Germany, Trier, the year 1581. It was a flourishing city full of life and commerce. The walls protected citizens, markets thrived, churches dictated daily life. But beneath this surface, something dark began to grow. Crop failures hit the region, sparking hunger. Diseases spread, claiming many lives. People desperately searched for a reason for their suffering. Because when suffering has a clear cause, it is easier to bear. And the people of Trier didn't find it in nature or the weather. They found it in the supernatural. Whispers filled the streets, quiet accusations grew louder. Neighbors watched each other with increasing mistrust. Friends began secretly suspecting and avoiding each other. You can imagine how this tension felt. One wrong word and your life could end. This is where one man steps into the picture.
Johann VII of Schönenberg was no ordinary ruler. He saw himself as God's instrument in the battle against evil. But his concept of justice was merciless and cold. Under his rule, Trier became the center of ruthless persecution. He firmly believed that witches would destroy the land, and he was determined to eradicate them by any means necessary. Interrogations were systematically organized and brutally conducted. Torture was not an exception, but a standard procedure. People were broken until they confessed everything that was demanded, and often they accused others to end their own suffering. Schönenberg consciously exploited this chain reaction. He created a system that fed on itself. Every name led to more victims and more trials. Can you imagine how helpless the people must have felt? Over time, Trier transformed into a vast web of suspicions. The prisons filled faster than new ones could be built. Screams from the dungeons echoed through the stone streets. Public executions became brutal spectacles for the populace. Fire blazed as people burned alive, and the crowd watched, trapped between fear and fascination. Maybe you would have stood there too, watching, not out of cruelty, but out of pure fear for your own life, because not participating could itself be seen as suspicious. Thus, every citizen became a part of this cruel system. Even children learned early whom they could trust, and the answer was usually no one.
But who was most often targeted by this cruel persecution? It was primarily women who were accused and destroyed. Midwives, widows, and single women were seen as particularly suspicious. Their knowledge was not admired, but feared as a threat. A healing hand could suddenly be interpreted as witchcraft. A wrong herbal recipe was twisted into proof of dark powers. You can imagine how quickly the tide could turn. Yesterday respected, today bound and sentenced to death. Many women were publicly humiliated before their sentence was carried out. They were forced to sign confessions they never understood. Under torture, they named names, often out of sheer desperation. And so the net tightened around more innocent victims. It was especially cruel that even young girls were not spared. Age or innocence offered no protection against the accusations. The fear of female independence played a decisive role, and it made this persecution even colder and more inhuman. If you had been a woman back then, would you have survived? But the horror reached even deeper, more disturbing levels, because eventually the fear made no exception for children. Under torture, adults began naming more new names, and these names often belonged to friends and even family. What happened to children was particularly shocking. They were interrogated, intimidated, and deliberately influenced. They were asked questions until they gave the desired answers. And suddenly, children accused their own parents of witchcraft. Imagine that moment vividly. A child points at their mother and calls her a witch, not out of hate, but out of fear and confusion. One sentence could mean a death sentence. The authorities used these statements mercilessly for new trials, for children were seen as especially credible witnesses at the time. Their words were barely questioned, accepted as truth. Thus, a system was created that continually fed itself. Friendships shattered, families were irrevocably destroyed. No one knew whom they could trust anymore. A wrong glance, a wrong word, a wrong suspicion, and even your own child could betray you. Fear was no longer just on the streets. It lived in every house, every family, every thought. And that is exactly what made this persecution so unbelievably dangerous. It didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed trust itself. Can you imagine living in such a world?
The persecution didn't remain confined to the city of Trier. It spread like wildfire to the surrounding villages. There, it often struck the people even harder and more mercilessly. A particularly shocking example is the village of Longwich, a small town nestled between vineyards and gentle hills. But behind this quiet facade, pure horror unfolded. Within a few years, a large part of the population was wiped out. Neighbors accused each other, often out of pure fear. Families were torn apart because one wrong word could destroy everything. People were dragged from their homes at night and taken away. The screams echoed through the narrow alleys until morning. Many never returned, as though they had never existed. You walk mentally through this village and see abandoned houses. Doors stand open as though the residents fled in haste, leaving everything behind. Children's toys lie in the dust, forgotten and never touched again. Fields overgrow because no one remains to tend them. The silence feels almost unnatural, as if life itself had given up. Some reports tell of entire families being wiped out. No name remained, no one remembered them anymore. Fear had not just emptied the village, it had erased it. And yet the trials continued as if nothing had happened. A system that didn't stop even in the face of total destruction. Hundreds of people lost their lives in those years, and with them stories, memories, and entire generations vanished. Can you imagine walking through a place that has been forgotten? Eventually, even this cruel system began to crack. Too many people had disappeared, too many doubts emerged. Some dared to speak out with quiet criticism. But for most, any insight came far too late. The wounds in Trier were deep and hardly healable. Trust had been destroyed, communities lay in ruins, and the memory of the screams remained in people's minds. Schönenberg's rule left a legacy of fear and death, a chapter burned deep into history. And it sends us an important warning to this day, for fear can destroy even the strongest societies. Now you stand at the end of this dark journey through Trier, but the most important question still remains open. What would you have done if you had lived there? Would you have stayed silent to save yourself, or would you have found the courage to resist? This question is more uncomfortable than it first seems, because it's not just about the past, it's about you too. History shows how quickly fear can change people, and how easily truth can be pushed into the background. If stories like these captivate you, join me further into the darkness, for this was just one of many forgotten chapters, and the next ones might be even closer to your reality.